welcome. I am so glad that you're here. So for those of you who don't know, or if this is your first time, Pastor Ashley, and I'm so glad that you're here. You probably, I think, have told all of you now that we're recording this because we have heard from multiple people throughout not just our community, but also across the Facebook world, that this is a conversation that a lot of people really want to be a part of, but can't be here tonight. And so I'm excited. I'm excited that y'all are here. I'm excited to have our faculty advisor and MSU professor, Carla Lasand, here to speak to us tonight. Y'all right, Fred? Be that guy, Fred. For those of you who don't know, that's important. Fred here, Mr. Fancy Man, is our district superintendent, which is a fancy word, really means nothing to most of you. But what it is really is that Fred was the pastor here before Kelly. And now Fred has actually taken this other position where he serves as like the pastor to all the churches in our district, which consists of about 77 churches. Yeah. So I am so thankful that he's here. This is a topic that is near and dear to his heart, as well as all of yours. And so he's here to just contribute to the conversation as needed and to let y'all know that you're not alone in this either. So, before we get started, I'm going to go ahead and open us up in prayer, and then Carla will take it from there. All right? Let's pray. Heavenly Father, Jesus, Lamb of God, Holy Spirit, great comforter, all whom are with us now, we give thanks to you for this time. We give thanks to you for the opportunity to come together and get real about topics that matter to us. Topics that the church has so often forgotten to address intimately, intentionally, within the context of community. And so this night we give you thanks, Lord, for this time and this space. May it be sacred. May this be one of those unique times in our lives where heaven and earth come crashing together, and we have an opportunity to recognize here and now that you are not a far-off God. That you are not a God who just abandons us to the awful ways of this world, but that you are right here with us in our very midst, and that you have felt every last bit of what humanity has to walk through. And so, Lord, give us strength and comfort this night. Give us courage and boldness, Lord, to be honest with you and honest with ourselves. And even, Lord, if it is appropriate to be honest with each other about where we are today, particularly as it relates to mental illness. So, God, we give this time to you. We give you thanks for it. In Jesus' name, amen.
Well, thank you, Ashley. It's a little bit bigger than I want it to be mic'd up. But we'll get through that, and hopefully we'll help some people on the other side who are watching. My name's Carla Lasand, as Ashley said, and I'm finishing into my 10th year at MSU. And, you know, things get a little bit serious when you start talking in decades, which our DS has been here for almost 10 years as well, correct? Yeah. My training is that I'm a cognitive psychologist, and I want to make it super, super clear to you all that I am not a practicing clinical psychologist, and the difference is that clinical psychologists, they can diagnose and treat mental illness, whereas cognitive psychologists, we can research and understand and teach, and we can tie it into our classes, but we aren't in the business of doing mental health practice like that. And I still think that there's a lot to explore, and I want to tell you why. I have so many students that come to me for empathy and concern and care, partly because I'm in the psychology faculty and it seems like a good fit, but partly because I think we all are walking among the need to really feel what's going on in this world, to feel what's going on with one another. And I just open myself up in that way for students to be empathetic and to really say, like, life is hard and how are we doing this? And specific, I probably ask a lot in my classes. Well, Sarah, you could probably say, like, I ask them how they're doing. And so I really, really do care. And college students I am a lifelong college student. And I really love that because I feel like even though when I first started, I was a little bit more like you, my students remind me all the time that I'm not as young as they are, and that's fine. With wisdom, hopefully those years come. But, there's just a real need to talk about what are the things that we carry with us in life? What are the flaws that we all have? And so what I want to do today is talk a little bit about my perspective on mental health, what the state of knowledge is like, and that probably sounds a little bit dry, a little bit boring, but I am going to ask you to reflect on you as both a person who's dealing with daily struggles and also as a Christian. I mean, that's where I feel extremely privileged to be here because typically I talk as a scholar or as a professor, and I don't, as much as I should, get to wear my Christianity on my sleeve. I mean, Fred has taught us that we should do that at all times. And so I do want you to keep in mind that we are going to wrap in where is God fitting into our world with this? How do we use his grace? How do we deal with the struggles and the questions that we might have in spite of being lifted and elevated by God? Like I like to do in my classes, I actually am going to have you do a little bit of work here and there. And it'll be a balance between some of you might feel comfortable raising your hand and speaking out, and that's fine. And others, you'll get to do a little bit of processing on your own. So when you think about mental illness, there's a lot of discussion. When I put up my first slide in intro psychology, we talk about the normal versus the abnormal, which is absolutely hilarious, isn't it? Like what a way to alienate a group by saying, here we're going to contextualize things as normal, and here we're going to contextualize things as abnormal. But really, that's where the field has developed. How has behavior and brain work and our emotional capacity changed, and at what point in time does it become abnormal? We'll try to answer that question a little bit for you. But when you think of living your life, walking through your life day to day in your normal experience, I want you to take the construction paper that you have, and I want you to think about two questions. The first question I want you to think of, if I said, who are you? If you'll write on the top of your piece of paper, and this is just for you. So whatever's on your heart, put it on the page. You can share it with your neighbor, or you can tell them to look away at certain points. So at the top of your paper, write, who am I? And then you can do a question mark, or maybe a ... sounds more appropriate for you, or an exclamation mark, or a unicorn, I don't know, whatever you like. A rainbow. Now, as you're thinking, who am I? I mean, no doubt you're in the context of talking about mental health. So there's probably thoughts of your inadequacies or difficulties, and I want you to embrace that, but I want you to write down a few words that describe who you are. So you all could take the easy way out and say student, but you should put others down in addition to that. So write a few things that you think represent traits of who you are, your personality, your gifts. Yeah, if the crayon totally throws you off, to be honest, I thought that it helps. I don't think I used a crayon until my son, who's almost 6, started writing with a crayon. But it's really freeing because it's not in the normal means of where you're writing notes with a pencil or a pen. It's like, it kind of strips it down for me a little bit to the basic level. So we're going to try to, strip down how we're thinking and feeling in that way. And also, how can you judge yourself when you're using a crayon? Yeah. It should have been those really thick crayons too, but too much planning. Now, I would love for you to write all day long, and certainly if you haven't captured your essence on secret as I'm talking, just keep writing who you are. That's fine with me. Now I want you to shift gears. We are so used to perception, and I want you to think about when you wrote who you are, how much of that is based on how you believe others judge you and value you and look at you. So now a second question is, who am I? But now this is the world. You should be kind to yourself if you want to, but you also should be true and you should be real. A level down, tell me something, describe on your paper something that you believe the world sees in you, that the world knows as one of your characteristics, gifts, traits, and so on. Now you're just exhausted because it's really hard to think about your inner feelings and then what the world sees, and it's just too much, right? I want you to notice, first of all, think about a frame that's hanging up in your house or your apartment or your dorm room. Can you visualize a frame? Think about what the purpose of a frame is. So just right off the top of your head, what does a frame do? What's its purpose? What does it manifest itself for? Quick, what words? Finishes. It's distinct. You know when you go to order pictures on Shutterfly and like one of the last steps is what kind of frame do you want? You're like, I can't be bothered with this. But think about the frame. You know, it contextualizes, it surrounds, it holds, it binds. Maybe those are some of the words that you're thinking of. And I want you to think back toward this description and look down at your responses. And I want you to think about which ones are framed negatively and which ones are framed positively. In other words, in psychology speak, we would call this valence, which sounds really robotic, like how many of your words are more positive and how many of your words are more negative. I just want you to think about that. And I don't know if you noticed, but when I said how the world perceives you, I didn't say anything negative. Like, I never said mental illness or strife or suffering or how you view yourself negatively. I said things that you think are positive. And that's what we would consider in the land of cognition. We talk about framing effects. How we speak, how we contextualize, and how we cap off something that we're delivering to others is really, really augmented by a frame. Here's an example. If your teacher stands up in front of you and says, here's what you all need to do so that you do not fail. Think about that. And then what if your teacher says, here's what you need to do so that you succeed, that you pass, that you are elevated with flying colors? Turn to the person next to you and describe which is more motivating to you. So you're in college, most of you, or you were, or you are going to be. What do you think? Talk about that for a moment. Just by a show of hands, and it's okay to have a didactic response where some of us feel one way and some of us feel another. How many are more compelled by the not fail? Raise your hand if the not fail resonates for you. And then what about this is the path to success? Okay. Would anyone feel comfortable like explaining that, like the root of that motivation? Sarah, thank you. It sounds a little bit like working on the fear of failure. Yeah. And negativity can really shape how we define ourselves and how we believe other people view ourselves. So Sarah, what if you said, I remember a time when I just killed it on this test. Like, all the information was flowing. It was awesome. It was an awesome feeling. Have you ever, you leave a test where you just feel like you rocked it. Like, can you imagine if you would have elicited that sort of response? I don't know. It takes a lot for us to shift our thinking in that way. But what I want to really get you to think about is how our frame is going to influence all the way downstream to things like mental illness, because we think of these repetitive thoughts and behaviors that we have. Another similar cognitive feature is something called growth mindset. Now, you are all probably done growing, but neurologically you're not. So you have until about the age of 25 to continue to develop your prefrontal cortex and so on. But all that aside, a growth mindset means that you see yourself as being able to change, and that you see yourself as being able to grow and change for the positive. You may have heard this defined as grit or grittiness, which I think sounds okay, but it's more fun to talk about a growth mindset. So think about the frame in which you view the world, and then also where you feel like you can either grow or change. Like, are you a grower? Do you think about growing? Do you think about doing better? Or what are the limitations that stop you from doing that? Okay, so now that we've set up a little bit of the cognitive part, like the stodgy, boring part maybe, we do have to talk about mental illness and try to situate the heart of who we are into some of the questions that we've been wrestling with. So one of the things that I think is really important for us to all be on the same page about the state of the field, the state of the science. So psychology has worked and wrestled and still is wrestling to be legitimized as a science. Fred knows this because he was an undergrad in psychology, and things are much different. So if you take psychology as a student now, you have to take brain-based classes. And the reason is because the perspective has entirely shifted in the last 100 years. We got any chemistry or physics or engineering people in the crowd? I mean, even nursing has its roots in much, much older decades and centuries. Psychology started in the United States at the turn of the century, right? And although I'm not going to say, like, in 19 this happened, but for 50 years thereafter, we looked at people's behavior. So how do you like twiddle your thumbs? Do you have a racing heart? Like, what does anxiety look like perhaps from outside your body? And no one really cared about the mental state. And sure, people had been wrestling for centuries about what to do with the mental state, but psychological testing was not a thing. So now I want you to compress the last 70 years. 70 years is not a long time. It's a tiny little speck in terms of our human existence. And if I tell you that for those 70 years, in the last, I would say it's even 20 years, we finally have resolved what we think mental illness is and what it does. In order to get us to that place, if you can think of what psychology might have looked like in the turn of the century, what mental illness would have looked like, if you knew somebody who had severe depression, or perhaps were schizophrenic, or had a really intense learning disability, what do you think life looked like for that individual? Think of maybe emotionally, environmentally. Anyone have an idea of, like, what did life probably look like? Mm-hmm. Yes, I'm seeing images of being compartmentalized, being shut in, being institutionalized, and the history of psychology has an ugly, ugly past in terms of participating in some of that institutionalization. A lot of our students will go to the St. Peter Mental Hospital, and they have a great historical room that talks about some of the barbaric treatment and the isolationist view that people had of psychology. And that was just in the early 1920s, 30s, 40s. In the 40s and 50s, psychologists across the nation were engaging in lobotomy. What's a lobotomy? It's like this. So literally, I hope your dinner is settled. But they would take the equivalent of a long tampering type of device, and they would shove it through your ocular sockets and just tear around at your prefrontal cortex with the desire and the thought that it was going to disrupt the negative mental functions that you were having. And that's in the 50s. You know, that's when some of your relatives were born, or your parents or your grandparents. So here we are. You know, it's like, this is really, really exciting. It's so bleak. All right, so what I want you to tell you now, it's kind of like the good news. Like, we have to bring God in eventually too. But the good news is we are situated better than we ever have been before to deal with mental illness. Now we know that mental illness is behavioral. We know that it's environmental and cultural, and we also know that it is brain-based. So when someone has cancer, did their behavior 100% affect that? Not necessarily, right? I mean, we can think of cases where people have some bad habits, but anyway. If you are diagnosed with Parkinson's disease, did you wish that upon yourself? Did you make that happen? No. It's a brain-based disease. If you lose a limb in a tragic accident, you know, how did that come to you? How did that become part of your being? So what we want as psychologists for the broader part of the world to realize that this is a disease. And so what we call it is a mental model, saying that we no longer can rely on just the behavior of someone to know what's going on, but we can rely on the brain, which is really exciting and also really nerve-wracking at the same time. How prevalent do you think mental illness is among Americans? If you had to put it into, you are probably going to overestimate this, but like, what is a percentage of maybe anxiety or depression among? It's on the rise. Here, go ahead and take one of these. This is from the National Alliance on Mental Illness. I have a lot of great resources of where you should go and things you should avoid when you're looking up mental health facts. What you'll notice here is the biggest number that pops out to me is 18.1%, because I'm looking for something that's consistent with, oh my gosh, people have a lot of problems, right? And I see 18.1%, and what kind of disorder is labeled there? Do you see it? It's hard to read. Anxiety. And then walking back, we have 6.9% depression, then bipolar, and then schizophrenia. Now, these numbers have stayed fairly consistent. If I chipped away at the last 20 years, 25 years, the anxiety is probably the only one that's changed by all Americans. Now, if I go up to MSU Mankato and I go to the counseling department and I ask for the Department of Mental Health's figures on college student depression and anxiety, would you take a guess as to, does it look like this? Does it look different? It looks different. Would you go with a high or a lower? I like the lower optimism. It's really good. So it's higher. The statistics on college campuses are somewhere around, it's hard to nail down, but 30 to 40% of the college population is seeking out some sort of mental health treatment, whether it's for behaviors like eating or sleeping or relationship issues, but that's where the percentages lie. Now, we have to kind of think of a chicken and egg thing. Why is it that, how old are most people in college? Like the average age, I think, at MSU is about 21.7 or something like that. So take your 18-year-olds to your 35-year-olds. Most of the time I don't see too many people above my age. And that's fine. But what I want you to do is think of, what is it? Is there something in our culture? Is there something in our world? Is there something going on that might be inflating or contributing to that increase. Tell your neighbor if you have an idea. These are your people now. These are your people who are saying they have more anxiety and depression and mental illness. So what do you think the cause is? I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit, so I'm just going to wave around and see if at least the dyads or the small groups will give me a few of the words that came out in discussion. Eric?
You said
Lacking. In their self-worth or lacking something. Something's missing. Good. I like that. How about ladies? Failure, not being good enough, not measuring up, not being enough. Yeah, there's a lot of learning and exploring that's going on. Any ideas? They've got them all. They've covered them widely. Okay, I've got some good news for you. So, mental illness develops in people in their teenage years, and you don't really see new diagnoses after the age of 24. So think about how that naturally is going to match up with the time that you're in college. Now, I'm not taking away from all the issues that you all talked about, but I'm saying this exploratory period where you're finding out who you are, where you suddenly have bills and work and class, and you're removed from some of your normal social network or your parents, and you have to figure that out. And it's during that time that your brain is finishing developing, and you're going to be going through this potential change of, if you are predisposed to a mental illness, it's going to happen. I mean, it's awful. It's going to happen now. So statistically, that's where a lot of the influx comes from. And what I also want to paint as a positive attribute is whenever we talk about health and wellness, we always think about I'm going to pick on men here, but older males, so we will exclude everybody here, like older male. Do you know any older males who are afraid to go to the doctor? Yeah. So they are the extreme. I'm going to paint the extreme picture. They don't want to go to the doctor because they are afraid of what? Yeah. But along the way, what are they doing? They're like walling off things, like it doesn't exist. And I mean, it's terrible. So now think about your generation. They have been told to ask for help more. They are told to use their resources a little bit more. And they do have this inclination to outreach, whether it's not always the best, the instant gratification. So I want to kind of paint you the good picture that I think a lot of it is the prevalence of going to ask for help, the social networking, and the fact that you ought to be coming into yourself during this time of life. And so that kind of takes away from the adages that people have, like, oh, kids these days, and oh, this generation is going into the toilet, or whatever it is that we hear. Because I don't think that that's the case. But I do think there are some consistencies in our views of how we view ourselves, how we view the world, and so on. So I want to get back to this idea of normal versus abnormal. Does anyone know how psychological disorders are diagnosed? I told you I don't diagnose, but I can tell you how they are diagnosed. Eric looks like he knows. There's a book. Yes. It's the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual number 5, which means they've had 4 other versions. And you wouldn't believe, if you went into the first version, the things that you would see as abnormal. They're things that are part of our culture now, like looking at the autism spectrum and so on is viewed entirely different than it was in the DSM-1. So I want you to think about that, as there is always going to be a cultural lens, a cultural constraint on what is normal. And are we going to change that in 20 years' time, 100 years' time? We absolutely are. So the reason why I want you to think about that is anything that disrupts your average daily functioning is considered abnormal. Oh my gosh, get out the pen, right? Anything that disrupts your normal functioning, being a human that is contributing, now you have to get out the meter, right? So the psychologist has to get out the meter and say, it's kind of like when you sit on that scale and they move the balancing metric over. I mean, that's going to look a lot different for a lot of different people. It has to do with how much you self-disclose, how well you know how to speak about yourself, your family. I've heard a lot of students who will say, my family doesn't believe in mental illness in a way that they think it is not a disease. They think it is a choice, or how many times have you heard culturally that people with depression ought to snap out of it, or they will change, things like that. So one of the things that I really want to encourage you about is that is really on the winds of change. That is what you have a responsibility as intellectuals, as learners, to know that we don't get to say that anymore because it's not true. But it's going to have to mean that, I had a student in my office the other day, and she said, I was going to counseling, but now that I'm not a student, I can't go. I said, well, what do you mean you can't go? And what do you think she said? I'll give you a little bit more information. She's a 23-year-old recent graduate. She moved back to a suburb around the cities to live with her parents again. She can't afford it, but what else? What happens, is it still 25 or 26 when you are on your parents' insurance? She said, my parents don't believe in mental illness. They don't think it's something that's real, and I can't go because that's humiliating to them. Right? That is so difficult. So she doesn't have the ability. So I do want you to think about that cultural role and how that you can really help change it. Okay. So now, I want you to write down, you've got how you view yourself, you have how society views yourself. Now, here is probably the place of more pain or indecision. Do you need some paper? I want you to write at least one thing that you hope to change. And it can't be about the world. It needs to be about you. Something that you would like to change. And as you're writing that down and as you're processing it, in your own way, I want you to evaluate its relation to mental illness. In some cases, you'll know that it's directly related. If you say, I want to be more outgoing in social situations, I want to find ways to dampen the anxiety, then the connection is probably quite clear for you. If it's about other behavioral traits, could be about how you feel, how you eat, how you think, it might be easy for you to connect this. Now this requires you to kind of have faith and be among truth with each other and know that it's a crowd where we're all here for the same reasons. If you would be so bold to raise your hand if the thing you want to change has something to do with not necessarily a label, because we want to avoid labeling people. We're not here to say this is who you are and this is what you have. That's not my job at all. But how many of you can honestly say it's related to your mental state? Okay. So that grabs a lot of us. And if you want to, you're welcome to think about later on if you'd like to share. I know it's a little bit hard when we're all on camera, right? Okay, so psychologists talk about how people have learned to think. And before we talk about the brighter news, the role of God and the role of our Christian faith in mental health, I want you to think about all the reasons why you could have adopted negative ways of thinking and or mental illness. So there's something called classical conditioning, which sounds really boring, and it is kind of boring, but it reminds you of dogs salivating. If you were part of any psychology class, you know that you put food out for the dog, and anything that you pair with that food will cause the dog to have a reaction, right? So who's got pets here? Yeah. So it's not just about putting out the food. What are other behaviors that you do when you go to put out the food? You clang around in the kitchen, right? Like you've got things going. It might be the same time every day, so you're dragging yourself out of bed. The drawers are opening, things are moving. And so that animal knows how to behave by a whole suite of variables. Guess what? So do you. So by the time, as little people, and I don't want you to sensitize yourself to your whole scope of life, but think about how you choose and how you chose to deal with defeat, failure, pain, neglect. Can you imagine any conditioned behaviors there? Now, cognitive appraisal is the framing part. So as a young person, as an adult, I want you to think about the appraisals that you've had. I know we make fun of this generation for all winning a medal and all getting the participant award. I don't think it's hard for you to remember when someone said something negative to you. When Mom or Aunt Betty or great-grandpa Larry unfortunately said something that sticks with you. We call that cognitive appraisal because often, just like going to find out how much your car is worth, it defines how much you are worth. It defines the way you feel about your value. So without making any of us tearful, I want you to think about that thought that is your cognitive appraisal. It's how you view the world each day. It's how you view yourself in it. And I can tell you, for me, it has two great dynamics. The first dynamic is do more, do better. Do the best you can. The second dynamic is you're not good enough. So you can imagine the pressure that people face with that. To know that they want to produce, they want to succeed, but yet they make the cognitive appraisal every day that somehow they're not good enough. So that's good cognition for you. The other part of this is the brain. Your brain, whether you feel it, you can't feel it, but it has created what we call neural pathways or connections. They have been defined, some as a function of your behavior, some as a function of what you eat, what you think, and so on. But you didn't do that. Like, you didn't say to your dopamine receptors, hey, don't absorb enough of that. Which, serotonin, dopamine, they're all related with mood and sleep and anxiety and things like that. So part of it then, so we've got the conditioning part, we've got the cognitive appraisal, and we have the brain. And any one of those can be enough, or in combination with each other. Oh my gosh, then we have genetics. Don't even, right? And funny things happen when I think it's great to be your age, because for the first time in your life, you see your family as people, and they're flawed humans more than they are your mother or your father. And you get to make your own kind of cognitive appraisal, right? Like, oh, that's what that was about when Mom did that. But I found the last 10 years that has been like a great exploration for me. Like, sometimes it's sad. Like, I think about when Grandpa was really neurotic, it was because he was probably suffering from a version of OCD. At least in a personality dimension. And knowing when my mom did certain things, and we're not going to stand up here and talk about my mother, because then you'll wonder who needs to be talking to whom, right? But now as an adult, raising 2 children, I see the struggle that she had with my brother and I recognize that for not just who she was, but some mental illness, because it's likely there's a strong genetic trait, just like addiction and so on. So now we have our genetics, happy day. And then we also do things like it sounds like no one wants to talk about Darwin in church, but I'm going to do it. We can do it. So then there's this pruning process of how you behave. We call it, in the grand scope of things, natural selection. But what that means is think about your coping mechanisms. Think about how you choose to deal with when you don't sleep well, when you don't eat well, when you don't communicate well, and how that carves off the approach that you take or the way that you feel. So all of these things make up the mental model. It's not one that has to be bigger or bolder than the other, but all of these things. Okay, so now we're gonna, I guess, do you have any questions about the culture, the stigma, the state of the field? You probably don't, because you're like, I want to know about me. But I don't want to pass up an opportunity for you to have a question before I transition. No? Okay. Very good. Okay, so this is the power, people. This is the moment where God, who's been here with us this whole time, gets brought front and center. Where we get to do the living with mental illness bump, bump, bump as a Christian. Praise God for that privilege, I can tell you. Because now you've got the dog eating its food, the way your mother was, your brain pathways, and overarching that all is you have the privilege of working through it with God, right? And many, many of your peers, many of your public, your friends, they just stop. Living with mental illness, stop. Okay, so I do have a couple fancy United Methodist theological statements that I think are really important and fun. But they bring up this question, this giant question. Anyone know what the giant question might be, like about mental illness that I haven't answered? It's like I have plugs in the audience. So we know it exists. We know God exists. So if we are a child, maybe a 5 to 8-year-old child, what might we do? Why? Yeah. Why me? Why now? Why with God? You know, as an operator of my life, as even if you've given God the helm. So what's coming around now is, and there's so many resources out there in terms of the mental health facts. If I were you, I would go straight to one of 3 resources. So if you want to know about your own personal mental health, and we'll talk about counseling at the end, you should try 3 places. APA.org, the American Psychological Association, the Association for Psychological Science. I mean, if you can get those 2 straight, you've won a prize. But that one's called APS. And the other one that really takes articles and distills them down so that my mom can understand them and my grandpa or whatever, is called Psychology Today. Getting information from any one of those sites will be guaranteed to be reputable, to speak truth of the science. So definitely check that out. Okay, so what you have in front of you is, it's a piece written by a single author, so it's not meant to, represent everyone in the United Methodist faith, but I do think that it provides some unique insight on suffering So as you're listening, I hope that you can look at that and read too, and think about the nature of God, who God is, who your God is. Does anyone have an answer to the question? Why do we have mental illness, or why you? And if you can answer that question, then you can take DS's job, or Ashley, perhaps. Have you ever thought about that? Like, I know it's like we're going from a serious discussion to turning it and making it internal, and I understand that that's hard to do. But if you could be so bold, have you ever thought that? Why me? And maybe it's not about mental illness. You've got someone who's suffering with dementia in your life, or Alzheimer's, or stage 4 inoperable cancer, right? What are some questions that might evolve, or thoughts that you might have along with why you? Anyone so bold? Or why does this happen?
I kind of think of it as like any other experience where if something bad happens to me, it's not necessarily about that experience being bad. It's about what comes out of that. And maybe that is for building my relationship up with God. Like when we are in dark times, maybe he wants us to draw closer to him, or like, that's about the gist of the way I think about it.
Thank you for being so bold. And also I wanted to let you know that this is a good time for my colleagues to also be part of the conversation. So summarizing that, right? It's like, I hear the word test somewhere in your, if, how, if, now, what? That seems hard. That seems hard.
Yeah, I think the question that it distills down to is, did God give me this? Right?
And what
That's
should
what
I do
I
with
hear,
it? Yeah.
right? That's where the heart of what you're saying gets to. Is like, well, I didn't hear her say that, but I hear a deeper question that would trigger in others, right? Yeah. No. So you're giving us an insight into how you think about that, how you answer, why me, why now? And you're saying it's because maybe there's a bigger thing that's happening that I can't quite put my finger on right now. That you just said he allows it.
Thank you. Let's hear lots of voices and see where, because clearly we're not good interpreters, Ashley. We have other strengths.
No, I agree with Alyssa. I think part of it can be just to see the outcome, but I also think it happens because we have sin. Because of that original sin, things happen like this, and I don't necessarily think it's God giving us this. I think it might have to deal, with Satan, and these things happen, but God doesn't leave us to walk on our own through it. We're not alone doing it. He's not doing it to punish us. So I think just having more of a perspective of, maybe God is allowing it, but he's not being like, oh, that sucks, you're on your own now. So I think kind of just the idea that we have sin, and that's kind of opened these doors, but that we don't have to do this all alone.
Awesome.
I guess the way I see it is like he's pushing you to see how far you can, like, what your strengths are and what your not strengths are, to see like, hey, she succeeds in doing this but has troubles with this, so how can I speak to her to help her in the places she's struggling in her relationships or in life altogether, and how I can be there better for her.
Did I touch that? Okay. Yeah, I remember when Stacy and I were trying to have kids. We were, I won't get into how that happens, but we struggled for quite some time. And at the same, we were missionaries in Ukraine. At the same time, there's another Canadian over there, and we would go to this church to pray every Sunday morning at this particular Orthodox church in town. And I got there yet again. Stacy had miscarried, and I was angry at God, and I remember just being incredibly angry at God. And at the same time, he was also angry at God because his wife was pregnant yet again with like child number 5, and so it was but it's similar in the sense that our inability, or there was something abnormal about us, and I remember thinking why are you, even with this deep theological brilliant mind that I have, I still went to, why are you doing this to me, God? Why is this happening to me? What have I done to deserve this? So.
Anyone have a chance to, I know it's hard to read and talk and imagine being put on the spot at the same time, but when you look at the response of that author to suffering, I know some of you are great quick reads, and you're the kind of student that's like ready before anyone else in the classroom. So can you draw upon something there, some sort of idea of what the author is saying about suffering? And as you're thinking about that, one of the things that Pastor Kelly and Pastor Ashley do really well is they preach and they're scripturally based, right? The words that heal are biblical. I'm not a pastor, but I do think there are places in the Bible where we can look for like biblical answers, right? There's a place where one of the people that Jesus has an opportunity to heal asks, like, who should we blame, myself or my mother or father? And Jesus' response is that it's no one to blame, that sin covers us all, and that we are all uniquely placed in that we have some sort of blemish or blackness. Is there anything that's coming up in that reading for you?
One of the things that I thought when I first looked at that was that it's like a human condition. That suffering is not unique to any one person. That suffering is part of humanity. And that makes me think, it makes me think about Jesus on the cross, right? It makes me think about like the ultimate depth of suffering, of being humiliated and shamed and tortured. And that suffering didn't have the last say, right? And that we have a God who is willing to enter into the suffering with us to prove that we're not alone in it, Anybody else? Did anything jump out from that? Yeah.
I guess one thing that I kind of saw was that it says that suffering happens to suffering and tragedies happen to Christians and non-Christians alike. But the difference is that we have God to help us through it if we don't turn away, which is sad that some people especially when it comes to mental health, instead of turning towards him, turn away from him.
Yes. I think there was another. No? Yeah. They're everywhere.
The part that really jumps out to me is in the story of the blind man, Jesus' answer to why it happened is so that God's mighty works might be displayed in him. And I've struggled with depression and suicide for most of my life, and what I've always turned to, this story is really good, but I also look at the story of Joseph, where this dude was in slavery and then he saved the world because of that. And if that hadn't happened to him, and so bad things happen to people, but then ultimately God works it for good. And like I can say that in my own life, like after struggling with suicide for years, I was able to tell people about that. And like, I don't know how many lives I saved, but I've told, hundreds of youth about like, yeah, suicide is a thing. And like, there was a suicide in Mankato, and I got to talk to like 80 kids like the next day and tell them like, yeah, suicide's real and it's something that people struggle with, and like I struggle with it and I'm a Christian, and this person struggles with it and they're a Christian. Like I don't know if it did any good, but like I want to believe it did.
It absolutely did. Yeah, you can feel it in your testimony.
What I love about what Peter just shared is that it is like skin on of what Alyssa said. Right? It really is. It really is that, you're not questioning whether or not God gave you depression, but you see the redemptive power of it, which is what Alyssa was saying, that, okay, whether or not God caused it, yes, he allowed it, but only because he can bring great good from it. Yeah. Hey, and you're married. Yeah, that's real good. Power couple over here.
I like what you shared, Peter. Yes. When you think about the core of that is that you've learned to move beyond your innermost fears, things that you were held victim of. And that really is demonstrative of, again, not a clinical perspective, but a perspective that I think we can all have, is that we need to be social beings. God calls us to be relational. We're in a relationship with him. And I think knowing that we are the mental health ... with God should also convene us to open up to other people. That's where the great stigma, I really, in my heart, believe that, give us just a few more years, a decade or more, and we just can't be like that. And, some of those things you talked about, like the way we feel inside. I mean, how many people will blame technology? Technology has a role, obviously, in how we feel about ourselves and what we do. And so I really also encourage you to, socialize is not about socializing with our virtual reality or our computers. So that's really about, it's the power of you, and the power of you to say, this is my brokenness. Let me tell you how I overcame it. Let me share with you. And that puts you in a vulnerable position, but it just extends God's hand to other people. So congratulations for being so relational. It's awesome.
I can't remember the name of it, but there's some kind of art form in China, maybe it's Japan, where where this great piece of china was made, and then it's thrown against the ground and then soldered back with gold in the broken pieces, and this is to make it more valuable. And I guess I kind of feel like that's a illustration for in our brokenness, and through being healed or redeemed, that our brokenness actually makes us more valuable. I was talking to Ashley and Carla earlier this week, and I have had panic attacks in my life where I didn't know they were panic attacks. I thought they were heart attacks. But when it was named, when someone told me, I think it's panic attacks, I was like, because I would walk down to the Ukrainian Polytech, doesn't matter, just a place where a little hospital, and they would hook up an EKG in the middle of my panic, and they said, nothing's wrong with you, and that just didn't seem right. I'm like, how can that be? And so finally someone just said, maybe it's in your mind. And I'm like, wow, that can't be. Could someone be so broken that their mind would be convincing their body that they're not well? Can you imagine that? I didn't think that was possible. So, but in the midst of all that, once I started to deal with the reality that maybe anxiety had gotten the best of me, I felt free for the first time. Like in the midst of that brokenness, I felt like God was going to have to be in control of my life now, because clearly I can't be. And that was actually freeing. It was like a really incredibly freeing moment, that because I think a lot of our anxiety and stuff comes from the need to control it, and we realize we're at our wits' end trying to control everything in the world and keeping it going. And but I was actually, the burden was relieved because I realized I couldn't, even if I wanted to. It's kind of like when you go to an airport. Sorry, I'm giving all my illustrations in at once. It's kind of like when you travel and you have all this luggage. I love it when I give it to the airline to take care of it, even though it says not responsible. But it's like you give it to them, and now you can just travel light, and hopefully it'll be there on the other side. But that's like my favorite moment when I travel, is just to give it, you take these bags, and now I don't have to worry about them until I see them in that destination. So.
Thank you. Imagery is really good for helping everyone around the topic. Thinking more about community, people can go back and forth about labeling. I think that a label is good if you are in the presence of someone who can successfully diagnose you. All our students take abnormal psychology, and it's like, okay, this class isn't about you. It's not about your family. We have to do all these primers. But there is a resource. I know some of you are maybe not at MSU, but other schools. The counseling center is free, and what that requires of you, though, is to use the resource. And we know that students are using the resource more than ever. So definitely visit that resource and come to me, and I will take you to there. I seriously tell that to my students. I can't do it for you, but I can show you where the door is, and I can amp you up. This is going to be the start to at least some sort of thoughtful healing and some sort of disclosure. So being able to speak and say and listen is so important. Whether it's just one-on-one or with a group. You all remember probably the time when for me it was middle school, and I started to realize that other families had problems. It's like, it's not just this that's going on in my house. And that only was amplified as a high school student and as a college student. And I don't want to say misery loves company, but what we have to realize is that, God has given us all great gifts. And one of those is, again, to be relational and to realize that the negative framing, the negative self-talk, that will pile on you and can just be the catalyst for a lot of our misery. What else are you thinking?
Yeah, we want to open this up. You don't have to share as boldly as Peter has, but what a gift it was, right, that he did. And so if there's something that you have a question, if there's, I don't know, we're not going to necessarily be like, share that and it's normal and you're fine, or you need to go see somebody. That's not what this is about. But if you have questions that you just want to throw out there, we would love to do our best to guide you and to answer if we can, or respond maybe would be an appropriate answer.
To walk beside you.
Yeah. All right, you go, girl.
So it's kind of hard because I struggle with anxiety, kind of mildly, but I feel like it's growing throughout college. But it was really hard because a couple weeks ago, I was walking across campus, and I kind of had, a little mild panic attack. For some people, they're probably like, what the heck? Like, you're just walking. What? That's weird. But, and so I was telling my roommate about it, and she goes, like, why does that freak you out? Like, why is being, socializing and stuff like that, like, why is that so hard? And I didn't know how to, like, answer that. I was like, I don't know. Like, maybe it's just, like, a weird thing that I have. But, so I talked to, like, my other roommates about it, and, one of my roommates, like, has the same thing, and, she kind of can relate to that. But it's kind of like when people don't understand it, it's like, how do you explain that? And, like, how do you get, like, other people to know how you feel without, like, judging and, like, stuff like that. So it's a hard thing, and I think that's, like, kind of why our society today, like, doesn't really understand it entirely, but it's, like, a growing, researching topic, so it's kind of relieving to hear that every once in a while, but
Thank you, Sarah. And Sarah is a psychology major, so she's just going to be on the cutting edge of all the great work that's to come.
That's right. Sarah, one of the most freeing days of my life was, many of you know this, but my husband Cody was diagnosed with bipolar type 1 just a little bit into our marriage. And I remember, Carla talks about having a label without anything else to go with it, and that's how we were functioning for about 4 years. We had a label, but no tools or no explanation for what that meant or how we ought to function. And I will never forget the day that we sat in a bipolar specialist's office, and we didn't say anything. And she told us exactly how we felt without us having to justify it, And that was the first time in my life where I was like, oh my gosh, I feel known, And it's because we were willing to walk into that office to a bipolar specialist and then to show up the next day to a bipolar support group where it was the same thing. We finally felt like for the first time in years, like, they get it. It's like that whole thing when you become instant best friends. Oh my gosh, you too? It's the same thing. And that's why we have to start talking about it. Because labels. I have PTSD and anxiety and depression that come with that. And so for me, that looks like recognizing what my triggers are. That looks like creating spaces and time in space where I can just take care of myself. And that looks totally different for me than it does for other people. But like today I was invited to lunch, and there was a moment where I was like, can I handle going out to lunch right now? I had to actively ask myself that question. Can I mentally and emotionally handle going to lunch today? Yeah, like we had tea last week, and I was like, can I handle, like we're going to tea. This should not be stressful, but because of where I am, and because I know what my triggers are, I'm able to ask myself that question and then answer honestly. So I just say that to encourage you that like what a gift it is that you can acknowledge it and then verbalize it to community, Yeah,
I would say that 9 times out of 10, your roommate that doesn't understand what you're going through has some very same thing. Like, not perhaps anxiety, but that's something that's so trying about being in relationships. Like, my husband knows me better than everyone and anyone, but we still can't manage to do things that keep, we can't crack through that shell sometimes where I become more insular and he becomes more extroverted. So what I say to that is people can sometimes be afraid to know yourself, but you're getting into this exploration where those voices of who you are going to be hopefully more concrete than ever before.
Answer? Seriously, not Twitter, but
Facebook.
Don't you think that all have some level of mental illness? That came in from DR. I think it's Dan Rivers.
Yeah, I mean, if we take all those conditions, all those variables, it's like tuning up something a little too loud. Like, all we have to do is have one of those variables tune up a little bit louder than the other, and we respond abnormally. I mean, and the aftermath is, okay, what do we do to quiet this down? So every brain, I believe, has the possibility of behaviorally and emotionally and mentally manifesting itself in something that doesn't do justice or positiveness for a person.
In the same way as our bodies can expose
Yeah.
itself to different illnesses,
Yeah,
our
like, I
brain
mean,
can too. Yeah.
do we have heart disease? Do we have high blood pressure? Well, how close are we to having heart disease or high blood pressure? Well, we get an assessment. And so I think the nice thing about mental illness is now trying to be right there, where the assessments haven't been perfect, but it's saying you might be here one day, you might be here one day, but are you on average where you need treatment, where you need some help?
So what is the prevailing treatment methods? Like, what if I went to a therapist, what would they?
Yeah.
How do they engage in treatment? And then what, as Christians, what can we do to help as well? I mean, how does our...
Yeah. The main line help these days in what people ascribe to is cognitive behavioral therapy. And that's a mouthful that basically takes a lot of the things that I told you today. The cognitive part is the how you think and how you respond, and that you are going to be working in the world in that way no matter what your behavior is like. Cognitive behavioral therapy is a combination of counseling type of behavior, so one-on-one or group type of therapy where you tell, you talk, you experience. And then the other part of it is using some sort of anti-anxiety, antidepressant medication. That's the combo that we're working with. Now, yeah, did you know there are positivity clubs in Minnesota? Positivity clubs? Yeah, like people who you are a member as a function of being really positive. I heard this on NPR. No, and it's like what they say is that, these folks are positive in the face of adversity. They tend to look at things more optimistically. And going back to what you wrote on your paper, I am blank. People see me as blank. Go back and say, like, is that positive and is that negative? And how could I have framed myself with more positivity? It can be a mental illness. It's more of a personality disorder, DS Fred, but those are extremely rare. And so you've just found a way to frame your life more positively. Yeah. No, I think I knew that some of us would put things that were negative. But in general, people do things. I'm kind, I'm a good friend. And some people keep it really simple. I am a sister. I am a wife, right? And so in all those responses, you can have things that are more concrete and more descriptive. I do want to tell you what I think the state of the field is with medication, because that's a question on a lot of people's minds. I was reading a book, and the psychiatrist said that using SSRIs and SNRIs is the equivalent to opening up the hood of your car and not knowing where to put the motor oil, but simply, dousing the engine and all the parts of the car with the motor oil and not like a specific funnel. In other words, I don't want to say that to you to dissuade people from using medication, but it's not, if you spend any time in psychology, you hear of this thing called the placebo effect, and you can have folks in a counseling setting in a really great trusted environment who think they're on medication and end up doing just as well or better than people who are exclusively on medication. And so what I know is that the field is just not refined enough. So we do have to be careful about how medication makes us feel, that the side effects, how it plays a role in other things that we're dealing with in life, but not shy away from it. Just know that it is a complicated vat that we're putting this medication into. And also, not to endorse the drug companies or anything, but there are valid clinical studies on many, many, many drugs as well.
And correct me if I'm wrong, Carla, but I think that's where it gets back to the cognitive behavioral therapy piece as well, right? So talk therapy, certainly, but for a lot of our mental illness diagnoses, cognitive behavioral therapy is the thing that needs to be coupled with medication, because it's not just about positivity, it's not just about being extraordinarily optimistic, it's about putting behaviors and systems in place that enable you to do well and to thrive. Pastor Kelly would call those trigger mechanisms. And so basically creating routine, eating a balanced meal multiple times a day, not just once, right? Exercising. And then there's also the critical component of actually talking it out, whether it's with a friend, a professional, a parent, or all three. It's all of it has to be together. And that's why so often the word that comes to mind for me is that we have to approach mental illness like we do our spirituality, like we do anything in life, holistically. We can't silo any of this. We can't say that, well, here's my physical health and there's my mental health and there's my emotional health. I'm not a body with a spirit, I am a spirit who has a body, right? It's all interconnected. And so I just think, that's probably why you're so well adjusted, Fred. Combination of all the things.
That's I think that Fred is pretty well adjusted. Yeah. But I also know that there's more information that serendipitously aligned with what Ashley was saying. So the United Methodist denomination, we have the Wesley Foundation that we're all becoming more familiar with. But John and Charles Wesley are summarized and quoted in this perspective of health and wholeness from the United Methodist Church. And basically, their cause to take up their health was not just about their physicality. It was about their spirituality and their mental health. And they were aware of that, talking about all these components being in orchestration with one another. And also that all sounds wonderful, and it's hard. It is really hard. So some of you do have to look at the variables of struggle. Is it financial? Is it emotional? If you could take away one of those variables and you need help doing that, that is the realest thing, in addition to knowing yourself, because you can try to know yourself, you can try to work on your self-actualization, but if you have something around you that you can get rid of, you have to really think about that too. So it's not, it's work, it's difficulty.
So we're coming close to the end of our time together, and I just want to open this up. If there are any other questions, if there are any other comments, if there's anything that we didn't answer or we didn't talk about tonight that you're like, I really thought we were going to be talking about this, bring it up, because nothing is off, or nothing is out of bounds, nothing's off limits. Dun, dun, dun.
A satisfied group, maybe. Oh, Pastor Fred, you asked what could we do in addition to the medication and the cognitive behavioral therapy. You know, I've learned in my class, I'm teaching a class on how to learn better, and we were just reading an article. We've heard about how sleep helps with memory and how it helps with obvious function, physical function. But this article took students who learned something and then they put them in a calming, dark environment. They made sure they didn't fall asleep, because that's really important. And then they tested those students again versus students who were allowed to do whatever they wanted. And what do you think those students did in the moment where they were told, now you have 20 minutes, the experimenter will be back with you in 20 minutes? And it's the same reason why, in a study on behavioral therapy, students on a park bench were given a small electric shocking object. And they were told, do you want to know how this feels? And they said, no. And the experimenter set it by them on the park bench and walked away and said, okay, this is the experiment. We just want you to sit here and we'll be back to get you. 20 minutes later, more than 50% of the college-age individuals, what did they do? They touched it. Oh, I forgot to tell you, they were devoid of their devices. They didn't have, and they were so uncomfortable with silence and meditation and listening that they would rather be shocked by the device. So, I know. But that's habitual and trained, just like eating well and having a routine. So I think putting our Creator back into that is, we need to figure out how to steal back our voice and God's voice. Because if we are constantly looking for affirmation and anxiously checking, and I'm telling you, I have to do it too. I'm working at it, right?
Is that what it is, though? It's looking for, is that the addictive component of the technologies that we're looking to see? We're feeding a narcissistic tendency, or what is it that we want to know that we're like, that someone out there cares about me, or is that what we look at it from?
Yeah, it sets you up for the same chemical that you feel when you eat chocolate or go for a long run. So it's a reward of dopamine. And it's the same reason why the rat is going to push the button, right?
So we didn't have cell phones in college, and we had these things called answering machines. And when we come back into our room, we would all look to see if it was blinking, because that meant that someone out there called me. But anyway, my roommate Rob, he was like, the first thing he would do, he would call him, so he could also leave messages. So we would leave messages that simply said, no one called for you, Rob. And you call me, remember that thing playing, I see the flashing light and you play it? And it just said, nobody called for you.
Real nice.
But it's the same sort of thing, and now we get those notifications every second to every little post that we do.
Yeah, and that's the real downfall in technology, is mostly good, but it's what we choose to do with it that's bad. So sit in the sun in a chair in front of a window, and it will be a fight to sit there. Go to bed without your phone next to you. I know when I'm alone and I have 10 minutes where no one's talking to me, I'm like, oh my gosh, what do I need to No, I don't need to do that. And so there's work to be done for all of us.
I wasn't making that face because, what a novel idea. Don't go to bed with your phone. I read an article about how, the radiation, actually physically alters your brain's ability to process, to rejuvenate, to do all these things. And I was like, oh my gosh, I forgot I wanted to buy an alarm clock to put next to my bed so that I could put my phone elsewhere. So that was that face. I wanted to ask you all a question. And if you are so bold, in Carla's words, I would really love to hear your answer. For those of you who do struggle with mental illness, for those of you who have a loved one who struggles with mental illness, for those of you who just feel lonely, maybe you don't have some sort of diagnosed whatever, I want to know how we being your pastors, we being the church, we being this community, can come alongside you. What is it that the church isn't doing that you need or want, wish to see?
This isn't really helpful, but I think you are doing great. I've never had, my pastor back home was great and awesome, but I mean, she was, I saw her on Sundays and that was it. She didn't necessarily make herself available. I mean, I had her phone number, but I wouldn't, necessarily text her. She wouldn't text me and be like, hey, let's grab lunch, So I think you making yourself available to us and making me able to be like, oh, I'm gonna go have lunch with my pastor. And my roommates are like, again? Like, you just did that. And I'm like, I know. So I think you're doing great. I mean, I've never had a connection with a pastor like this before, so that's been really fun.
I feel like maybe as a group we could more get together, one-on-one, because I know I don't really talk to anybody outside of this group but Rose. And then, hey girl, what's up? And then, Sarah on our no child show up nursery calls. That's about it. I don't feel like we really interact with each other and get to know each other better and how we're struggling in our own lives and see if they have advice that could help us out from an experience they have.
So one of the things that we hope to do this semester, I know last semester we were kicking off and just focusing on the book and everything else, but this semester, my hope is that the Sunday nights where we're not doing this, we are doing that. And then those of you who are able and have the bandwidth in your lives to create space like what you're talking about, typically what we've seen is that from these class meetings, that naturally happens. That people just click, like you and Rose, that people just naturally begin to want to do life together. And that's already starting the very little that you know. So I can only imagine that that'll grow this semester. That's just a word of encouragement, not dampening. That's I want to create space for that too. Our what?
We were forced friendships. You were forced friendships? Yes, our fathers are childhood best friends.
Oh,
and they decided they want to live now their childhood through us.
That's right.
So we're
You don't mind.
So we're a forced friendship, but we like it.
Oh, talk into the microphone. Yeah, we need it on video.
Hi guys, I came in late. Sorry. Hi. Yay. Because I know when you're talking about how awesome your pastors were, you're talking about me, right? Not Ashley. No, anyway. Oh, of course. So Ashley asked the question, what do we need? What do you need? And I want to flip it. I want to tell you what the church needs from y'all. Y'all are growing up in a time where while it's still very taboo for many people in our world to talk about mental illness, it is less so for you than it was for the generations before you. And so what as the lead pastor of Hilltop, I can say what our church needs is for y'all to lead this conversation, for y'all to be open about your struggles, for y'all to be open about the relationships that you're in, for y'all to be open with this longing to know more, to learn more, and to lead the conversation, because that's where it's going to come from. It's going to come from y'all. Y'all are pushing the envelope on this. Y'all are wanting this. There are people within the church that they don't know they want it yet. It's never even been a thought in their mind that this is a conversation we can have. This is a conversation we can have in the church. You mean God cares about mental illness? Those sort of things are just things that we've done a poor job of doing in the church, and I'm so thankful that y'all are here talking about this. So what the church needs from you is for y'all to continue leading this conversation and pushing us forward. And relying on the great help that you have with Ashley and Carla and just some awesome resources that you have. But keep pushing us and keep leading us in this conversation.
Thanks, Kelly. Okay, well, if there's not anything else, is there anything else? Okay, this is just the beginning of the conversation. One thing that you don't know some of you might, I may have blabbed about this, is that we're going to have a part 2 of this discussion. This is not like the end all. We have not covered everything. There will be things that come up from here until who knows when. And so we're going to continue this conversation. This is not something that we hope to happen in silo. This is not something that we hope just happens tonight, meaning, yes, there will be a second Let's Get Real about mental illness, but there will also be class meeting every week in between. And so between now and the next Get Real talk, whether it's about mental illness or it's about pornography or it's about premarital sex or whatever it is that's the next one, I don't know yet, but you will know when I know. This is a conversation we have to keep having. We didn't answer all our questions. We didn't ask all our questions. And so just know that if you want to grab coffee with me or lunch, I love that. That's right, a little... Anywho, my point is, it's not over. And it is a gift to journey with you. And so thank you for showing up, and thank you for being vulnerable, and thank you for creating space in your busy lives to be here. All right, we're going to close in prayer. Can we give a hand to Professor Lassand, AKA Carla? One thing you don't know about her before we pray, maybe you do, is that she's our faculty advisor, which what that means, you probably don't know. It means that she's on our board of directors for the Wesley Foundation, that she has been praying for you and working tirelessly behind the scenes to help make this happen. It also means she's going to be the one that's like with us in it. And so this is not the last time you'll be seeing her. For better, where she is in it. And so she's going to be helping our leadership team once we develop that to write a constitution, to become a registered student organization, and she's going to be very much boots on the ground with us. So I'm
pleasure.
just
Very glad for that. Thanks.
so excited to have her on the team. All right, let's pray. Oh, precious Lord, Savior, friend, I thank you for the gift of community. I thank you for the gift of walking out our faith hand in hand with others who know, Lord, others who are not afraid to walk the line, others who are not afraid to climb into the pit to show us that there's a ladder ready for us to climb back out when we're ready. Lord, we thank you that you are a God who does not stand far off, but that you are one who poured out into human flesh so that we might know beyond a shadow of doubt that you get it. You get our fragility, you get our humanity, you get our suffering, and Lord, it does not have to have the final say. You proved it on Calvary with that empty tomb. And so, Lord, we give you thanks for this night. We ask that you would bless our sleep this evening and give us encouragement as we go forward, that we have done the next best step. We have shown up. We have shown up to learn more about you and more about ourselves as we grow closer in relationship with you and walk into more and more of our holiness that you call us to. We love you. We praise you, and it's in Jesus' name that we pray.